Okay, I'm Ryan, and I'm going to share with you a story that I tell myself to rationalize my life and profession, and maybe my industry. Here we go. Word of warning, I'm not going to read many slides, but I'll read this one. This presentation contains provocations and opinions that don't necessarily reflect the view of my employer, including but not limited to an unironic appreciation of Clippy, who I'm assuming you all are familiar with. And if you don't believe my sincerity, that is me dressed as Clippy in that photograph. And not only did I make that costume myself for Halloween a couple years ago, it hung in my child's nursery for the first 2 years of his life. And as a sort of academic experience, I'm going to find out how that works out for him. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to tell you my life story. I'm going to tell you the history of computers, and I'm going to predict the future. So that's what we're here for today. First, there's going to be a particular bent towards character-forward technology for this as a theme for this whole operation. And let me start with the happiest moment of my life, Christmas morning, 1987. And I was gifted an Elfie 2. Did anybody have an Elfie 2? That's all right. Let's watch the commercial. Oh, will the audio work for us here? Come back to me. AV man, how are we doing on this?
Do you have the audio thing plugged in?
That might help. Talk amongst yourselves. 3 minutes, go back to the wedding. Here we go. All right, here we go.
Because I got it right! Look! Butterfly begins with a B.
I'm so proud of you. You get more out of the play school years with Alfie, your child's first computer, with his own way of teaching spelling, math, even colors.
I got it right. I'm so proud of you.
Feeling good about the play school years.
So basically, I've been chasing that high since 1987. So much so that in high school, I earned this passive-aggressive yearbook caption where I was making one of my crazy pictures in the art loft, and I was famous. Did anyone else from Maryville High School? No? Okay. I went on. I know that Shannon spoke for the new school yesterday. I wasn't here for that, but I heard it was wonderful. I also was at the new school. I was an honor student at Parsons and Lang College studying creative writing and illustration. You can tell I was an honor student because I could balance so many bottles on my head by the time I graduated. I thought I would be a cartoonist, making comics or storyboards for film or music videos or something. These are some of my works from that era. But this was the early 2000s, and I made my hay creating web pages, as maybe some of you did. I would sort of fake that I was a web developer, and I would put cartoons into every project I worked on. I'm skipping some beats to the story. There's some twists and turns. Took me to India, Japan, etc. But when I came back to the States in 2006, I applied for my first full-time job, and this is a screenshot of the very email where Google congratulated me to join their ranks as a web specialist. Which was like a generalist, actually. But really what I did is I made icons, like millions of icons. Like so many icons. These are a sampling. One of my first and famous icons was the Street View Pegman. Does anybody ever use Street View Pegman? I know this is maybe not the place to admit you use Google products, but this is the one we had a bunch of different examples that we presented. The most boring one was chosen, but at the same time, I had an idea that wouldn't it be funny if to advertise this new product, we dressed up the product manager, a guy named Steven, as a Pegman, and he would explain the product kind of like Gumby or like a stormtrooper from Spaceballs. And it'd be so funny because he wouldn't have elbows. That was like my whole point. And I was amazed that they actually agreed. And they built the costume. But I should have been suspicious because they asked me how tall I was and how much I weighed. And that's how I became the spokesman for Street View in 2007. And I was in Google's first viral marketing video. I honestly, this is true story, I didn't know until the studio right over that I would be using my name or face, but you can find me on the internet. And you could also find me in ASCII magazine, a popular Japanese tech magazine that I found in the Narita airport, which I couldn't read most of, but I saw an illustration of myself, and I could read this, which I was very proud of. And I have like a running, top choice for my tombstone. But my impact was to be felt elsewhere. YouTube comments are not the kindest, but I soldiered on, and so did Google Maps. And in fact, a couple of years later, about 6 years or so later, they refactored the entire thing. Actually, yesterday, I think, or the day before, was Google Maps' 15th birthday. They did a new redesign. But in 2013, they announced that everything was getting redone, and it was going to be faster and better in every single way, except for one. Anybody notice anything missing? They took away the Street View Peg Man. And much to my validation, it was the #1 complaint of the whole new redesign. Countless engineering hours, untold millions of dollars went into this refactoring, and they had to relaunch Google Maps with a giant ad campaign welcoming Pegman back. That's not what I'm most famous for at Google. It probably would be the 10 years or so I spent working on the Google homepage logos. This was the first one. Any latent hippies know what this one was for? Yay, it's for Burning Man. That's right. They literally put a person behind the logo, and that's largely what we've been trying to do for 21 years since. These are some of my favorites. I got to celebrate some of my heroes, and muck with the logo a bit. It was a good ride. But we weren't expecting to see this slide in this conference. What we were doing, inadvertently, I think, was making something of a character of the company itself and the way we celebrated things and how we celebrated it and what we celebrated on its most visible surface. This is chapter 2. There's 3 chapters. We're going to talk about computer interfaces for a second. This is an extremely limited and biased perspective, but I got the mic. What are you going to do about it? In the beginning-ish, there were machines like this, a Teletype 33 that didn't even have a screen, and it hooked up into a microcomputer that you can imagine wasn't so micro. Flash forward, that's the 60s, flash forward into the late 70s, early 80s. People, places like Bell Labs come up with interfaces, but really a Macintosh computer in 1984 really kind of cracked it open with a graphic user interface. And as a storyteller, a very exciting development because it really used the power of metaphor to make the unfamiliar familiar. The files and folders and trash can that were inches away from this machine in your office were the words and constructions that were used to explain how your information was being, organized. Some might say that metaphor went too far with our paperclip friend, but hold that thought. We're going to get back to them in a second. The metaphor of desktop computing largely extends to mobile phones. I mean, now there's a bunch of interesting things going on with sensors, and obviously things are smaller, but you still see evidence of those types of metaphors. And in around 2010, computers started acting funny, and I mean that, like they started acting funny. That's when Siri launched, and if you were to do a Google search a few years later, it would look something like this, where even typing something like funny would autocomplete to all these references to Siri. And this, mental model of talking to computers, and even computers that would have a sense of humor, really started to become part of the cultural consciousness. So much so that, did you know Siri is billed above Joker in Lego Batman? He's like the antagonist the entire film. And shout out for that. And then you take a product like Amazon's Echo, where Alexa is not just like a tack-on feature, it's actually the entire interface. If you don't believe me, think about the advertisement for the Super Bowl they had a couple of years ago, where it wasn't about like the new skills or the features or the price or any of that kind of stuff. It was just Alexa as a character. And you were supposed to be concerned for her as a protagonist having lost her voice. That's basically how I got in that business. So, implicitly creating a character for Google through the doodles, I parlayed that experience into having a seat at the table for trying to create something of a personality for the Google Assistant. This is its logo, just while I'm indoctrinating you with our branding. If I'm going to be real, personality is a bit of a stretch. Really what we have is something of a constellation of Easter eggs that make up a shockingly large percentage of the corpus of the things that people talk to when they talk to Google Assistant. But our hope is to eventually, get into a place where we can have a more concrete character. This is the final chapter, so I hope you're paying attention. This is the good stuff. This is where this is where I'm giving it all away. Some people think the future is going to look like, the Echo was pretty cool. Going to look like the Minority Report, right? If you've seen that film based on the Philip K. Dick story, there's going to be all these like swirling screens and this future stuff. Pretty cool, but I'm skeptical because I'm a fairly sophisticated tech user and I don't know how to turn off the iCloud notifications on my iPhone to have them like stop telling me that my storage is almost full. So I'm very doubtful that like the larger world is going to be able to like deal with a completely new and foreign user interface. Others might think that there's this like Borg upon us where we're going to have like face computers or some kind of like microchip put in our head, which, or Neuralink if you're an Elon Musk fan. And I'm skeptical of that too because like we don't really need it. We're already connected so much to our phones that we carry with us in our pocket. There's no need for the chip in our head. It's a much less messy, operation. But there is one pop culture reference that I do want to advocate for as the future of technology. And just generally a great show to watch if you've got some time, which is Pee-wee's Playhouse. Any Pee-wee fans in the house? Yeah, all right. You can, they came in the front. I appreciate that, and my robber in the back. As you probably remember, everything in Pee-wee's Playhouse was anthropomorphic. It was amazing. Cherry, the chair you sat on, Magic Screen, which is a whole heck of a lot like an iPad, if you ask me, and then, Conky, who's, the character that would give the magic word every day. I would propose the magic word for our conversation here today is character. That's the word that I keep coming back to. Please don't scream real loud; it's going to get pretty annoying. This is a definition of character that I'd like to propose. But I want to shout out a researcher that I work with, Alice Fang, who wrote this definition. And I also want to break it down. So, character being an external representation of a coherent set of internal attributes revealed in a particular scene. I know you all can read, but let's talk about like some of what that means. Like an external representation, meaning the sounds and visuals, the dialogue, the way its face or lack thereof. Internal attributes like what makes it. It's subjected to obstacles. If you think of this in terms of like character, like a theater piece, what is my motivation? And then the particular scene, that's the stage that sets it up. And in the case of a character for technology, it doesn't have to be exactly anthropomorphic. You can imagine like when you're deleting an app, there's a character and a stage here. What is the motivation? Not to die. You're about to delete these apps, and they're shivering, and that's a really interesting insight from Apple to project like a human expression onto something as mundane as an icon. And those types of character traits are all around us in technology. So some of these are successful, some are not. But Anki, the robotics company that recently folded, had some really interesting examples of this. I heard an anecdote from somebody who worked at iRobot working on Roombas, where in tech support situations where people are told don't worry, we'll send you a new one. They're like, what are you talking about? Like, she's broken. Like, you need to fix her. Like, don't send me a new one. Or things like Jibo, which I'm proud to have a sticker of, was a really great example of an embodied, type of character you could use as a smart display and speaker. And I think that's a really interesting vector for this opportunity, and where I want to talk about some possibility. Where you have this idea of like internal, external, and like stage attributes that make up for a character that can be part of your lives. And there's some things you can decide to keep in your design or decide not to keep in your design, but there's some inalienable things that, our academic friends have taught us, which is, that when you hear a voice, we automatically, as human beings, complete personality traits around that voice. We make assumptions in microseconds about gender, race, sexuality, socioeconomic status, education level, and things that are like meaningful identity markers that, whether or not intended by the designers, are like real attributes of the experience. And then on top of that, any kind of visual representation will like instantly snap you into having some sort of like emotional relationship with something, even as simple as a pet rock. So which brings us to a googly-eyed friend who maybe wasn't as successful. So why did people hate the paperclip? Well, again, I turned to academics. A colleague of mine, Luke Schwartz, wrote a paper, Why People Hate the Paperclip, working with Clifford Nass, who was quoted in the previous slide. And essentially the TLDR is that it overpromised and underdelivered. You can read the quote for yourself, but that's the gist of things. But if you ask the team that made Clippy, including this guy, Steven Samowski, who was no scrub, the lead PM of the Clippy, product manager of the Clippy project, and then went on to be a president of Windows, he just thought they were too early. And with that in mind, let's think of the way the world's changed since Office 97, when Clippy debuted. First of all, you don't put software on floppy disks anymore, which is the way most people install Office 97. But also the internet became a massive opportunity. Also, technology becomes increasingly able to sense and to remember and in some hodgepodgey ways, deduce and think. It's also big business. There's a lot of money to be made. There's a lot of people in this space. You also are an increasingly visual society. So this is even all the way back to 2015. More than half of comments on Instagram had emojis. We're also finding all kind of new ways to get information that is much more individualized as opposed to institutionalized, where this is Ryan's World on YouTube. Any subscribers? Well, there's 24 million of them. And this particular video, last I checked, had over 8 million views, and he's just testing out plastic foods. Meanwhile, the way we communicate to each other is radically different from where it was a couple decades ago, where just a couple days ago on New Year's, there was 100 billion messages in a single day on WhatsApp. And speaking of messenger apps, in China alone, there's more than 1 billion users just on WeChat. And again to China, thinking about the world's largest and fastest growing AI assistant space, conversational AI assistant space, the three major players, Baidu, Alibaba, and Xiaomi, all have extremely character-forward experiences, and business is booming. They're seeing explosive growth, in the tens and hundreds of millions. That's to say nothing of Microsoft, who has an interesting foothold in this world because they're both obviously big in the West, but they have a really pretty wild footprint in China, where I'm not sure if y'all are familiar with Xiaoice, but it's an incredibly popular conversational AI that has hundreds of millions of monthly active users. And it's essentially like a virtual girlfriend, but in its back end, it's a conversational agent that's being white labeled to dozens of partners in East Asia with the humble goal of powering every AI being on the planet. And here's what I appreciate about what seems to be acknowledged by the kind of burgeoning Chinese industry, is where we see a metaphor of desktop computers having files and folders and trash cans. In the conversational interface worlds, it's the character itself is a metaphor. And that character can be anything. It doesn't have to be an office assistant. It could be a doctor, or a teacher, or a cook, or a robot, or a dog, or whatever you're into. No judgment. And that leads me to 3 conclusions for you all as I go a couple minutes over. Thank you for your patience. First of all, if you're in the business or you're looking to explore it, I would encourage any kind of exploration and analysis on the power of anthropomorphic characters and technology, because in my own experience, I've seen that there's quite a bit of a there. Also to consider, there is a trend line towards technology becoming increasingly more person-like, both in its representation and also its capabilities. And then finally, maybe it's time the paperclip comes back, or one of its progeny. And with that, I thank you for your time.